Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode number 56, The Rise of Gwynedd. Gwynedd was one of the earliest recorded Welsh kingdoms, and since their king Cadwallon was defeated in 634 at Heaven's Field, it had been a kingdom for the most part on the wane. Gwynedd had been obviously defeated in this particular incident, and over the last 50 years or so, seemed to have been reduced, seemingly shut out of the public record. That's about to change. Offa, the great king, was dead. He had sat on the throne for over 40 years, and in that time created a massive state within England, which dominated the affairs of the Saxons and controlled or made clients of much of Wales. With his death, his son took over the crown of Mercia, and titular head of southern Britain. But he too died, and it is claimed by an illness in just half a year. With the death of Ecgfrith, Coenwulf came to power and engaged his subject kingdoms. In 796 or 797, the Welsh, probably seeing an opportunity to break free of Mercian domination, engaged their forces on Rhuthlan. At the battle, Merduth, the king of Dofed, was killed. However, the battle must have gone the Welsh way, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says nothing about it, and Coenwulf returned shortly after for another go. Usually, if there was success, if they murdered the king, that would have been important enough to make mention of. The fact that they didn't probably means it was a significant defeat for Mercia. And so in 798 AD, Coenwulf once again invades Wales. This time, he is claimed to have killed Caradog ap Mirion, the king of Gwynedd, and he appears to have continued the dominance of Wales in a similar fashion to Offa at this point. And it's here at this time, as we get to this specific death, that everything changes for Wales, and really England is affected as well, because at this point we see a change in the king. Now, Caradog was an important king. He was a significant king. He was king almost as the same amount of time as Offa, and yet is made hardly any mention of, except for in a couple of genealogical lists. He's mostly known for having taken over the throne at the death of Rhodri, and because of this is claimed to have overthrown the person who either was the legitimate heir or a person who was a bastard via another peasant father parentage, as he was claimed to have been the court woodsman. Now, this is in poetry, and it's mentioned in a couple of places within Welsh writings. There's no evidence of this from the time period, so we don't really know. We just have what amounts to the National Enquirer's version or the tabloid versions of what happened. So we don't really know enough about it to be able to say what was going on. We just know that that's the rumor. The rumor is that his parent was a woodsman. And the reason they claim is because Rhodri at the time was very old. And so it was observed and declared that the reason why this happened is because old Rhodri couldn't have fathered a child. He was just so ancient or so feeble. And we all know that that genetically is untrue. The likelihood of someone being able to father a child at 90 as a male, while not as likely as when they're 20, is still a possibility. I mean, it's a narrow possibility just based on the way men age and how that affects their ability to genetically spread themselves out, if you were. But it is a legitimate thing that they can still accomplish. There's enough evidence out there. Now, for a woman in that circumstance, it's next to impossible, depending on situations, I would guess. But for a man, it is still feasibly possible. So the fact that the guy was old isn't really good justification. So unless there was something else about it, or it was the fact of what happened later, justifies itself by way of this. And this is part of the problem when you have what amounts to histories that are written by other people. They have a tendency to determine what happens later and how you're perceived. Often we look at guys like Nero and Caligula, who are famous emperors who are well known for being just insane, but yet at the same time we only know that from their opposition. And so do we know for a fact that they're crazy? Do we know for a fact that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, blah, 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 all these kind of things? We know nothing really about that. All we know is what we're told by the history books. And if the history books are 100 to 200 years beyond that, and then poetry, which comes even later, then it's a bit like that kind of storytelling when somebody passes on an oral conversation. Eventually, when it gets to the final person, it may not in any way resemble the original facts. And top that off with the fact that it doesn't suit the best interest of the next few heirs to the throne to have this guy being seen as sympathetic, or actually, worse yet, the rightful heir to the throne. Of course, if that's the case, and if he's an illegitimate heir, then here's the interesting part of this. We know from our studies and discussions of Welsh history in the past, especially about the kinship rules, he still is a legitimate heir as long as the person who's the head of the family declares him so. So if the king declared he's his heir before he died, it doesn't matter that he wasn't a legitimate heir, because in Welsh eyes, he is legitimate. And so he is an inheritor of the throne. Now, you can make a genetic question of, is he literally a descendant of this person? But you can no longer claim that he isn't an heir to the throne. So again, this may show certain things. But interestingly enough, like I said, Caradog takes over. At no point in the succeeding 40 years after that, because he takes over about 754, is there a claim made by Cian that he wanted the kingship. And it's Cian who is the next in line to the throne, if we are to understand how this works. So for the entire time that Caradog ap Mercian is a
news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International, coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts, and remember, don't believe everything you read.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Warriors in Their Own Words, a podcast that presents the unvarnished, unsanitized truth of what we have asked of those who defend this nation. As a country, we need these stories more than ever. Stories from Americans who have borne the battle, including 30-year-old remastered interviews with veterans from World War I recounting their time in the trenches of Europe, and with veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and from our most recent conflicts in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other battlefields Americans may never have heard of. Hear their stories by listening to Warriors in Their Own Words wherever you find podcasts.
King of Gwynedd, he is effectively unprotested, or there doesn't appear to be a situation where Cian is coming back to take him out. So all of this happens, and we get to 798, and Gwynedd invades Wales again, and this time he kills Caradog ap Mercian, who is at that point king. And at this point, there is a power vacuum. And so we dawn into the 9th century with chaos being basically what we're going to live with in the Welsh kingdoms for a little bit. As kings continue to be killed, they die through various circumstances, and a lot of them die, and the powerful ones die. It isn't just, local prince and local lord and local peasant villager. It is the kings of the land that are being knocked off constantly. And you can imagine how chaotic that is for the area of Wales at the time. We saw this with Offa and his predecessors, that the more they were around and the more they did stuff like that, the more likely it was that we would hear less and less from Wales. And so in 805, for example, the Annals of Ulster mention that there was a plague that broke out across Ireland. And it is seen as to have been big enough of an issue that they mention it. And not only that, there's also this concept that at the time, Ireland and Wales had trade relations. They were sending stuff back and forward. Obviously, North Wales has an ancestral connection to Ireland, so you can understand that there would even be more of that. And of course, this is an age where we're starting to see the rise of people who will be able to take ships across far, far distances, even over from Europe to North America. So we'll see that this is no longer a boundary or even close to a barrier. So if this happens in 805 in Ireland, you can imagine, much like the previous plagues that came out of Justinian, these could reach Wales. And in 807, we're told by the Chronicles of the Princes that Arthur died, who was king of Ceredigion. And then in 808, the royal death toll grows even larger as Thrun of Doifed and Cadel, the king of Powys, die as well. And that's all they give you. They don't give you any more than that. They don't go into any details. They don't tell you who or what or how. And when you look at other sources like the Annals of Ulster or the Welsh Annals themselves, or if you look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, there's no mention of how these men died. It's just that they did die. And however, if we take it in concert with the aforementioned plague, it could be a smoking gun to why there's so much royal death mentioned. That rather than being a military death, I mean, certainly these men could have all died of old age, but realistically in the medieval era, that didn't happen a whole lot to kings. They generally got overthrown, they lost battles, they died of illnesses. Living long years was unusual, which is part of the reason why it becomes a problem sometimes. And in the case of these men, it did become a problem. And that's why I say from my mind, just looking at the sources, it almost feels like this plague has gone over into Wales and has caused this. And if you think about it, these are kings, these are not just small fries. These are the big kings of Wales. I mean, we're talking about Dyfed and Powys, who are some of the biggest kingdoms in Wales at the time. And Ceredigion is not a small one either. And in fact, this does a lot to tear it apart. And conversely, only, 9 years earlier, the king of Gwynedd has died, and in his place is someone who hasn't made a lot of impact on the historical record. Cynan ap Rhodri, or Cynan Didwethi, isn't really mentioned again, other than in one other circumstance and in one other main occasion. But he is the king of record for almost 20 years in Gwynedd. And so he's important, he's significant. And yet, he seems to always be ignored. He's never hardly mentioned. He may have been a baby when his father died. Thus, that's what held him back from taking the throne. A baby has no say in what happens to it after it's born unless there's someone to speak for it. And in this case, this would be a very similar situation. And so he ascends to the throne, but only after the previous king has passed away. And in the end, this issue of his legitimacy is claimed to be part of the reason why he ends up in a civil war. Now, the problem with that argument goes is that this may not be as simple as that. That sounds really conveniently easy. And if we look at the way Welsh history works, it's never easy. And I don't think so in this case either. During the early teens of the 9th century, as Coenwulf again invades, this time into Gwynedd in 816 and 817, it seems to almost set off a huge issue in Wales. And at this point is when Hywel y Caradog, in other words, apparently the son of Caradog, who had been the former king, takes command after exiling Cynan. So what happened? Why did that happen? And more to the point, what happens afterwards? Because even though he's claimed to be king by the Welsh annals, in 817 and 818, so a year after Coenwulf has come in, which does make one wonder if Coenwulf was somehow allied to Hywel, if Hywel was actually had fled to Coenwulf to try and get his support in taking back the throne, and that's the reason why he invades and ravages Snowdonia and then takes control of Hrwfnog, which is this territory near Rhos. also at a time when, as we know from previous commentaries, that Powys is in the descendancy, may not even really fully exist. So Rous is basically left to its own devices without its various partners. And it's not clear if the Mercians are then involved in the later battle in Anglesey in 1817 or 18, where, again, these two individuals are claimed to have fought. And on this occasion, Kynon is sent packing. So you wonder if Hywel lost the first battle but won the second one, or if maybe they're basically a part of the same battle and it's just effectively been fought over a year because you have winter season, which is not easy fighting. So people take a break and then they go back at it in the spring. And it's also not clear whether the Mercians were even involved in this particular part of the war, because at this point is when it's claimed that Coinwulf has devastated Dyfed and is actually involved and entrapped into that argument and that war. So again, all of this is happening to the Welsh kingdoms. I mean, if you got the Mercians into Dyfed, it tells you how bad things are for Powys and for Gwent and all of those areas around there, because they are not influencing or stopping the Mercians. They apparently cannot even defend themselves against the Mercians anymore, who basically are having free reign on the west coast of Wales as much as they did on the east side of Wales. So that shows, again, that the influence of Mercia, even at this point, as it starts to go into its descendancy very shortly, is still affecting and controlling a large portion of the countryside. And it's this problem which then allows them to interfere. And, of course, much like the English kings will do pretty much from here on out, they influence who becomes king. They influence who controls the kingdoms and who becomes next in line for the throne because of their ability to dominate and their ability to force their will upon the Welsh. And this is a problem that will continue pretty much from now until the end of, well, till the modern age, someone would argue. And so that problem will continue to go forward, obviously. But conversely, we also have this interesting dichotomy of problems. If Kynon is not the legitimate heir to the throne, like the legitimate descendant of Rhodri, then does that make Hywel the good, the penultimate leader, Hywel for Dyfed, actually illegitimate and actually not a descendant of the great line that had existed as the first main dynasty in Gwynedd? And that brings up all sorts of questions, and nobody really has any answers to all this. We're only guessing based on the fact that we have very sketchy evidence even for who Kynon is. We only really kind of know. He's the only one we can really officially identify as being a descendant of the king, whereas Hywel ap Caradog, we're not even sure about. We don't even know truthfully. We have suspicions, we have suspecting, but we don't know. And making it even worse in all this case is the guy who's going to come next, and how sketchy his claim to the throne is, because if Hywel's claim is kind of loose, just because his father had been Caradog doesn't mean he was the legitimate heir to the throne, especially if Kynon actually has the better argument. If Kynon has the better argument and the better genealogical legitimacy, then what? Now, of course, as we said earlier, that doesn't affect the way kinship rules work in Wales. So if Hywel and Kynon are actually related, then there could have been some explanation as to why we find Caradog as the king and Kynon apparently not, arguing that point. One might be able to say that that doesn't mean a lot, but there is certainly some contention that that could be the case, and we could argue that. And if that's the case, if these two are related, then that changes a lot of the dynamic, because now all of a sudden, you know, they may not have as weak of a claim to the throne as it seemed. So the other interesting part of all of this is now we get At the death of Hywel in 825, we had an all-new claimant to the throne, and one that we're going to talk a lot more in depth in the coming weeks, and his name is Mercia Firich. And he will be a bone of contention for many, many years to come, but he is the one who creates what we consider to be the rise of Gwynedd. It's him and his ability to grow his dynasty as the second dynasty in Wales for Gwynedd, the second and biggest dynasty that will go forward, the one that we know so much more about because of this. And it's Mercia who commissions the History Britannium, in part, we think, to legitimize himself and to make him seem important. And it's also under Mercia's reign that we first hear the name Arthur and hold in line this idea of a noble person, not from noble blood, who becomes the leader of the people, even when he's not necessarily legitimate. And so again, it harkens back to this whole argument about Cynan, but it also harkens to his own legitimacy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about the noisy neighbors next week, I guess, when we get into this, the new neighbors even, and their arrival to Ireland. But until then, thank you for listening. Thank you for contributing to this podcast. Thank you for those that are contributing through our Patreon. It is much appreciated. Without you, I could not continue to do this podcast. If you would like to help our podcast out, you can go to patreon.com/Welsh History, and you can contribute there, become a member, a supporter even of our podcast, and help me to fund the books and the studying and the research that I have to get in order to talk about this process and this project. Until next time, everyone, thank you very much. Thank you. And if you want to reach me, you can reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach me on Twitter at Welsh History Pod. My personal account is at JohnDMP. And everything we do is on distractionsmedia.com. So please go check that out as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Edge of the Abyss Creations is a proud sponsor of the Welsh History Podcast, your one-stop shop for unique jewelry, paintings, and other crafty creations. You can find us at facebook.com/edgeoftheabyss1.
This has been a Distractions Media production. For more info, you can check out everything we do at distractionsmedia.com.
A news story gets shared by a friend on social media, or you catch a tweet that really makes your blood boil. But how do you separate fact from fiction? That's the premise behind Disinformation, a 10-part series from Evergreen Podcasts and Emergent Risk International coming this fall. Tune into Disinformation wherever you get your podcasts, and remember, don't believe everything you read.